New Haven. Just breathe. Slow and calm. Madria's voice was smooth and steady, and she watched the young boy sitting next to her through eyes that were half closed. He in turn stared at the pile of tinder in front of them both, with a determined expression that carried with its heavy dose of dread. There's nothing to worry about, Jason. The tinder's the only thing that would light, and we're far enough away that we won't get burned. Just concentrate like we practiced, and don't worry about it so much. Jason was one of the orphans that now lived in the castle, along with the men of the guard. 3 years ago, his parents had died in the siege in New Haven, leaving him nowhere to go. His father had been one of the Black Guard under her command, and his mother had been one of the servants who had died when they got in the way of the Black Pond assassin. Because of the madness of the siege and its aftermath, it took people a while to realize that there were now several orphans living in the castle. The council had wanted to simply chuck them into the orphanage and call it done, but when Majoria had found out about it, she had thrown a fit. She inspected the orphanage and found it to be in horrible state of disrepair, not fit to house children, in her opinion. She had gone to the council to secure funds for its repair, but they had turned the idea down flat. Saras had been beyond furious, but Majoria had simply smiled and thanked them for their time. The next morning, each council member who had voted no for the extra money woke up with a note neatly pinned to their nightclothes, asking, "What do you think would happen to your children if you were no longer around?" Somehow after that, the money was suddenly available, and there was no way that she was letting the children of her men live there while she was still around. She had taken care of their parents, and when they died, that meant she was going to take care of their children. And so the children of the guard had moved into a set of rooms at the castle, being taken care of by some of the servants and mentored by the soldiers that lived there as well. It had been difficult at times, but Majoria had made a promise. She would take care of the families of her people. It was really that simple for her. Jason, the boy sitting next to her, had been about 9 when the siege happened. Now, 3 years later, it seemed that he was growing into an enlightenment of his own. He was a fire starter, or perhaps someone who could control fire as he willed. It was really too early in his training to tell. So far, he could only manage to cause fire to flare up unexpectedly, mostly when he was upset. This came to light when they realized that the problems they had been having with fires had been due to Jason. He had been in an argument with Lily, another one of the orphans, and Majoria had moved it to break it up. Right as she had, the logs behind her in the fireplace has burst into flame, blackening the ceiling and causing her to lose several inches of her hair in the process. The braid that hung over her shoulder used to stretch down almost to her waist. Now it merely reached to below her shoulder blades. The number of jokes about redheads having flaming tempers had more than tripled. Jason had taken one look at what had happened and had run out of the room in complete terror. Once she had calmed Lily down and changed into other clothes, it had taken her and several other men almost 5 hours to track the kid down, and another hour of her talking him through a locked door for her to convince him that she wasn't going to throw him out into the street just because he had almost lit her on fire. Ever since then, they had been working together, several hours a day, in order to help him get control of his newfound ability, at least to the point where he wasn't causing random flare-ups every time he got upset. Jason was having trouble controlling his ability, and she had written a letter to the White Shadows, asking for advice on training them. But until their answer arrived, she was making do with her own best instincts, which for now told her that working with him and making sure that he wasn't afraid of what he could do was the best thing that she could do for him. Which left them sitting in the middle of the courtyard, staring at a pile of tinder, with several buckets of water sitting beside them. "Come on, Jason. Deep breath in and focus. Once more, and we can be done for the day." Jason nodded and took a deep, shuddering breath, focused entirely on the pile of the dried twigs and grass in front of him. Sweat gathered on his brow, and his muscles clenched. Then, with a hissing roar, the pile in front of them was engulfed in a merry bonfire. He sat back with a sigh and looked over at her. Majoria smiled and reached over to hug him with one arm. Very good. They watched the pile burn down to ashes before getting up to go in. Thomas growled in frustration under his breath as he watched the newest recruits working in the yard. The problem with some of them is that they were straight from the nobility, which meant that they had private instructors in the art of fighting. Not that this meant that they were bad fighters, but that they weren't up to the standard that he expected from his guards. Even worse, that some of them hoped to someday become knights. If they tried to fight beyond their abilities, most of them would end up dead on a battlefield someday. Finally, he had to step in. Drawing his rapier, he walked into the middle of the bout and disarmed them both with a few moves, letting their weapons spin away in the hit of the dust. You both fight too pretty. You flourish and pose and act like this is a duel. It isn't. You are both fighting for your lives, not honor. If you continue to act like nobility when you fight, you will die. It's that simple. He sheathed the sword and planted both hands on his hips. Both young men looked scornful at his words. It was obvious that they believed that their lineage would protect them, and not all the words that he had would make a difference. Shaking his head, he looked around at the rest of the guards, standing around at ease in their crisp uniforms, waiting for their turns to practice. Then he walked past them to the different corner of the yard, where a ragtag group of men and women sat in the dirt, watching a few of their number go after each other in something that was just short of a killing frenzy. He tapped one young woman on the shoulder, smiling politely, when she looked up at him. "Excuse me, I need to teach a few of my recruits a lesson. Would you mind helping me out?" She nodded in return, picking up a set of sticks and brushing the dust off her pants as she followed him. He returned to his group and stood in front of them. "So, you two believe that since you've been taught to fight since you could hold a blade, you don't need to learn anything else, right?" They at least had the grace not to nod, but he could see the answer in their eyes. He stepped to the side and gestured to the young woman standing beside him. "So here's a chance to prove that you're right. If you can win in a bout against her, you'll have proved that your way is better. The both of you. Formally trained against one person who never had a day of formal training before she got here." Thomas stepped back and gestured for them to all start. The two men lost a moment glancing at each other in confusion while the young woman took her sticks in both hands and went on the attack. It was clear after just a moment that she was the better fighter as she chased them both around the ring, working first on one then the other, pushing them into each other and tripping them up. In the first minute of the fight, it was clear that she had won, but Thomas let the bout continue for the full usual 10 minutes just to prove his point. Once the bout was over, the two former nobles were panting and gasping in the dirt, while the young woman dressed in black stood over them with her sticks in hand. "Thank you for the demonstration. It was much appreciated." Thomas gave a respectful nod while the young woman bowed in return. She went back to her group while Thomas returned to his. "Now, start again and do it right this time." Hours later, Marjorie was sitting alone in the common room of the Blackguards' barracks, stitching together a broken piece of practice armor. The braid that hung over her shoulder was streaked with white. The patch at her temple had remained white ever since her brush with death 3 years ago. Between that and the stories that evidently went around about the woman who came back from death had led to some interesting rumors floating around the barracks that were evidently used to frighten new recruits. She didn't mind so much. If they were already afraid of her, she didn't have to work so hard to get them worked into shape. It was quiet and almost peaceful. The only sounds one floated in through the open window. Suddenly she raised her head, alerted by the sense that something had changed. Since she didn't have any type of enlightenment, Marjorie had honed her senses over the years until she frequently sensed things that others missed. She couldn't pinpoint what it was, but something was different. Slipping the hilt of the dagger into one hand, she turned and peered into the shadows, searching for what had alerted her. "Hello?" From behind her, there was the slightest scrape of leather on stone. That was the only warning that she had before a figure dressed in black leather launched itself at her. Marjorie barely dodged out of the way in time, twisting as she did so that she could land a firm push on the other's back and send them stumbling on past. Spinning off the ball of one foot, Marjorie put another dagger and set herself for a fight. Unfortunately, she recognized the person that was attacking her, and she knew that this wasn't going to get away without a struggle. "All right, then," she guessed with the dagger and a bring-it-on motion. "Let's see what you've got." The other woman grinned evilly and pulled a pair of sticks from her back, setting herself in a fighting stance as well. She pressed something on the sticks that caused sickle-like blades to pop out, making them fighting skies. With a quick pair of steps, the other woman pressed the attack while Mageria dropped down and brought one leg around in a sweeping motion. The other woman jumped up on the table, kicking a bowl at Mageria's head. She, in turn, rolled under the table and launched herself upwards, slamming the table up and over. She heard a grunt as the other woman fell, then rolled and sprang back up. She brought her sis up and around in a move that would have ripped her throat out if Mageria hadn't blocked it with her forearm. The only thing that saved her from losing her arm was the fact that she wore vambraces, heavily reinforced with metal ribs. She'd have a bruise, but it was worth it as she rotated her arm around and used the motion to pull the Sith from her opponent. Her opponent hissed in frustration and brought her other stick around in a backhand move to try and smash it into Mageria's jaw. She ducked and tackled the other woman, pushing her into the wall. For a few minutes, both women traded blows that would have done considerable damage if any of them had managed to land, yet they both kept fighting. At one point, Mageria managed to get a grip on the other woman's shirt and arm, using it to try and throw her against the wall. Instead of hitting the wall, she managed to use momentum to run up and flip over Mageria, grabbing her in turn and spinning her around. The other woman used the opportunity to launch a roundhouse punch that Mageria wasn't completely able to dodge, but she rolled with it and ended up standing a couple feet away. Turning, she grabbed random things off the table and flung them into her attacker with deadly accuracy. She dodged some, grabbed a few others out of the air, but she couldn't dodge them all. The other woman took a couple of steps back under the rain of missiles, not noticing that Mageria was driving towards her in a puddle of something gleaming in the light. One boot heel caught the edge of it and went out from under her. She flailed wildly before twisting and landing badly. Mageria didn't let the opportunity slip by. She sprinted over and grabbed her, twisting one arm up and planting it in the other woman's back to drive her to the floor. With a grunt, she grabbed the back of the woman's neck and slammed her head onto the floor. Yield, sham. The desert. Out in the desert of Valcrest, a sandstorm raged fiercely around the hopeless wasteland. Wherever it traveled, it consumed and eventually destroyed everything in its path. Animals, people, and what little plant life and water there was left in this part of the Valcrest bowed down in the wind's mighty conquest. None dared to say stop, and none dared to stand up for themselves as the raging storm destroyed everything Mother Nature held dear. And then it was gone. As if nothing had happened, the storm ceased to exist, and the desert went back to its quiet and luring state. However, not everything was as it seemed. Right where the storm had just flailed to gather its strength to move towards the ruins in front of it, a group of people came into view. There were 4 of them, and each of them rode on their own horse as well. From above, they formed a formation that looked a lot like a diamond. One was riding ahead, 2 were riding just behind the man in the front, and a clear distance was built between each of them, while the last one rode a couple of meters behind them all. The group had their destination in sight, and the path had been clear ever since the small tornado had been vanquished by unknown means. The man in the front of the group continued to ride in silence as the other companions suddenly began to talk among themselves. So this is Valcrest. Not much to look at. The man in chainmail suit said and looked around at the seemingly never-ending desert. The man was known for his pessimistic attitude and his realistic way to look at life. The leader of the group liked his opinions from time to time, while the others found him to be amusing and a pain in the ass. No, we're just on the desert, this far. I'm certain that Valcrest has more to offer us before we've done here. The only woman in the group explained, as her gaze turned itself over to the man riding behind her. The woman wore white robes, and by her waist there was a large leather belt, and by her knee pads, chest and shoulders, there were plated pieces that were meant to protect her weak spots from harm. She wasn't always this serious, but around their leader, her master, she tended to be dead serious. I don't give a shit if there's going to be better places in this desert. Give me an ice-cold ale and some roasted meat, and I won't care if we're going to the very pits of hell itself. The large person riding next to the woman grunted loudly and gave away a hearty laugh. This being was equipped in a large black plate armor that covered just above everything from top to toe. He even wore a pitch-black helmet over his large head. This person had already assumed the role of